There are other things to consider in what you might agree on. So if you've got a written lease, or if you've got some sort of oral lease in a scenario where it's not necessarily a hotel and it's a more casual stay over, what have you put in writing, or what have you agreed to? Because the way the law treats agreements between landlords and innkeepers is different. And just for, three very specific examples, those laws are different about how they address personal property, how they treat acts by third parties that are not either the tenant or landlord or the guest or innkeeper, and how they handle the disposal of someone's property when they're left behind on the premises. When it comes to personal property, a landlord doesn't owe any duty to prevent things like theft unless the landlord has sort of fallen down on a duty. So a landlord has a duty to keep the premises fit and habitable. That's in the law as a part of the landlord's duty. That's in case law, as you can see an example of below. That means, like, if your landlord is aware and on notice that your door doesn't lock anymore, well, that's a duty that they need to be upholding. People are, usually expecting their doors to lock. And so then it might be more of a case in that kind of scenario where if a landlord hasn't fixed that and a theft occurs, the landlord might be liable, but it would be something for a judge to determine. But the landlord generally owes no duty to prevent theft in those scenarios, whereas an innkeeper generally is liable if something happens. So just a general concept would say that they are liable for any loss or damage to a guest's property unless that property is lost or destroyed by something like an act of God or a public enemy, or by the fault of the guests themselves. If you drop your phone on the floor and it breaks, the landlord's not liable for that, but otherwise they are. The South Carolina law sort of specifically states that when an innkeeper posts notice, that kind of counts towards that liability. If they're telling you to lock the door, to put your valuables in a safe, to protect them, that sort of absolves them of that liability. But there's a big difference between the landlord who has no duty unless they really are just standing down on the things that they should be doing as far as the premises goes and keeping it fit and habitable, and an innkeeper who really needs to be reminding people of, this place might be unsafe, you're not familiar with it, and putting people on notice through signs and stuff like that. Different look there. When it comes to third parties, landlords don't really have a duty to protect against harm that we could foresee from a third party unless they sort of voluntarily take that upon themselves. And that's widely different than an innkeeper who does have a duty to protect against harm that they can foresee to a guest if that act by the innkeeper is less costly than the harm would suffer. So it certainly costs less for a keeper to put up a security system or cameras or a fence to keep their guests safe than it does for a guest to get injured or anything worse. So innkeepers have to protect from the acts of others, whereas a landlord doesn't necessarily unless they choose to take that responsibility upon themselves. So if any of the agreements sort of suggest that there's no duty there, that looks a lot more like a landlord than it does like an innkeeper. And finally, disposing of your property. A landlord, how they choose to dispose of it, what they agree to or tell you in a written agreement, if it looks a lot more like going through the eviction process for anything over $500, where they have to actually put you on notice that you're leaving and those sort of things, get an order from the court to set you out of the property and dispose, that seems a lot more like a landlord-tenant situation than if the agreement implies, like an innkeeper could, that they are just going to sell your property at auction after they sort of give notice, at least in South Carolina, to 3 different places in the area. So if it looks like they can just make a quick sell after a little bit of advertising, that seems a little bit more like an innkeeper than it does like a landlord.